I'm going to talk about largely the chapter that deals with the need for a new social compact, the role of business in managing social and economic change. Our observation is that we're living in very extraordinary times in South Africa. We're living in times of radical uncertainty. It's not clear where the country is headed with respect to its social and economic future. And also we believe that the existing tools and mechanisms that were meant to help manage transition as well as economic dialogue, and the example we give here is that of NEDLAC, are woefully inadequate for the challenges that the country faces today. The country faces multiple crises: political crisis, social crisis, economic crisis, institutional crisis. And our observation, from which goes back to the early 1990s when we entered the democratic dispensation, is that there have not been adequate tools to complement the political transition with a credible, well thought out socio-economic transformation framework. And we put that out there very glaringly, and we argue that whereas on the side of the private sector there was a lot of preoccupation with securing economic stability in neoliberal terms and ensuring that the new government that was to come into place doesn't upset much of the able cut. On the other hand, the ANC was preoccupied or obsessed with a political arrangement or managing the political transition, managing the relationship with the erstwhile National Party government, securing the aspects such as your sunset clauses, making sure that the government of national unity is not shaken, and managing a process towards reconciliation. What was missing, the bridge that was missing between the two, and which in our view has robbed society of much of progress that could have taken us further, was the absence of a credible socio-economic transformation framework. It was not part of the negotiated settlement. That is but one of the failures or the omissions. The other one has to do with institutional deficiencies in the current political arrangement, or with the current political elite. There was not much thought and an attempt to build solid institutions of the state in order to drive social and economic change. State weakness has been the feature of this government from the outset, save in the early phase of the transition when you had a small cadre of bureaucrats and politicians whose minds were focused on developmental programs, on stabilizing the economy, and on thinking ahead about transformation. But there was no critical mass that would ensure that we, at the end of the day, we rescript the spatial arrangement of apartheid, we rescript the patterns of economic ownership, the patterns of socio-economic, the socio-economic profile of South Africa and inclusion in economic activities. So essentially, there has been a failure to carry out, there has been a failure by the current political elite to carry out its historic mission There have been new problems around institutions, institutional defects, and all of this threatens socio-economic stability in the long run. So to kind of summarize a couple of points that we make. One is that the social compact we have currently, and that is institutionalized in the form of NEDLAC, established in 1994, needs to be changed. It needs to be revamped significantly. It simply cannot help us to navigate into the future. Two, the relationship between government, business, and labor is fractured. Society is going through deep tensions and fractures. On one level, the fractures are between business and labor, as we saw in the mining sector, and also as we saw with Marikana. The second set of tensions are between government and society, as we saw with the rise of public service delivery protests and lack of trust between society and government, and essentially dissatisfaction by society in government, and very few people believe that government can really lead change. Three, business itself is highly fragmented along racial lines. People no longer see it as a credible voice for change. It's often defensive about its role and responsibilities to some of the challenges we confronted with in society, as well as not wanting to be in the spotlight or to take a step to helping to provide solutions. You talk to business executives who tell you that the government there's transformation in the JSE because PIC owns quite a large stake in the JSE in listed companies. The same can be said, for an example, about the IDC, which also owns some blue chip stocks in SAPI, Sasol, and other entities. A very narrow, parochial, cynical view of transformation that is punted by business. Fourth, I think there's a need for a series of confidence building measures between government, business, and key actors in society. And I think that a resolution will begin by questioning the existing political arrangement, to ask hard questions about the current elite, whether they are suited to help us solve our challenges, to ask difficult questions about the social compact that we have in place, and to start to think imaginatively about what is possible in the future. And we set out some outlines in the paper. And finally, these ideas we think are possible. There's a case, the Mexican case, we don't talk about it in the paper, but I've looked at it quite closely, where, for an example, President Pena Nieto, when he came into power, I think in 2012 in Mexico, in 2013, there was a social compact that was cobbled together by all the three major parties in Mexico to essentially to strengthen the Mexican state, to democratize the economy and politics, and to enhance citizen participation in the design, implementation, and evaluation of public policy. And they put together a program that government would follow in the next six years, between 2013 and 2018. And this was a pact first amongst the political parties, all of them, and this creates confidence for society to believe that there's a shared common understanding about where society should go, because this is based on the appreciation that the problems are really, really deep, and there's so much that is at stake. Social stability is at stake. The future generations are at stake if nothing is done urgently. Unfortunately, we suffer from the problem of adversariality between political parties, but also between society and government. And we propose ways in which we can reset social dialogue in South Africa. Thanks.
The idea that we had a deficient socioeconomic transformation framework in the transition from apartheid. And I think, we can talk as much as we want about the institutional mechanisms that might create some kind of social compact, the types of mechanisms we can have for dialogue and breaching the gaps between political parties. But ultimately, there has to be some kind of meaningful, unifying framework that actually people can rally around. And I do think there is a deficiency within this in the country. We basically have an approach to economic policy thinking that is very much everything all at once. It's about trying to do as much as possible across society and to deal with all the problems that we have all at once, but without really tying that level of transformation to a specific vision for how development works and how people are actually transformed in the real world. So I want to basically make 3 points about some of the incompatibilities or some of the issues that are raised within the way we think about economic policy. And the first that I want to raise is particularly how we think about generations. So I would claim that the way we think about people becoming richer and people getting out of poverty and transformation happening is very much over a single generation for a single set of people, a single people. So basically the way we have, the image we have, the imagined scenario is that someone is able to access a very high quality public school, regardless of where they come from or how much money their parents had. They're able to use that school and various other state institutions to gain access to the education they need, to get a decent job, and to get into the middle class or into the upper classes. Now that's an image that takes place over one generation, but that ignores many of the fundamental structural problems that make it very hard for people coming from poor backgrounds to really achieve that over a single lifetime. If we look at the history of development around the world, the model we've seen that is much more prevalent and basically universal is that the way development happens is over multiple generations. A parent, for example, who is working in a farm is able to earn enough to send their child to the city, who's then able to get a decent working class job and get access to the middle class, who can then educate their children, and maybe they become economists and political experts, and it all falls apart there. But basically, this is the image that we have, right, of parents actually allowing their children to move a little bit further up and up that chain. And I think there's good reason to believe that that is how development just works. And I'll give you 3 reasons. First of all, if you look pretty much everywhere, that has been the model. Barring massive social fragmentation and change like a war, or barring a social system that is very different from what we have in the rest of the world, there really hasn't been many examples of countries advancing over a single generation. It takes at least 50 years and a good 3 generations for that to happen and for people to start entering the middle class. The second thing is that really you can look at the evidence about how restrictive it is to be poor and how that does limit your opportunities. Being rich or middle class gives you absolute advantages, whether it's in education or access to healthcare or simple stability in knowing where your next meal is going to come from. That's been proved, I think, in countless academic studies, and it's something that we have to acknowledge. We have to acknowledge the fact that if people are poor, we can try and make our public institutions as good as possible, but the fact of our injustices and inequalities in this country will limit their possibilities. And then the third thing is just to look at South Africa. We had a system for 50, 100 years that was very focused in an overwhelming way on helping people, a very small fraction and a minority of the white minority, advance as fast as possible. And even then, it took a good 50 years, and it took policies like allowing preferential access to working class jobs, or preferential access to the cities, or preferential access to education for change to actually happen. Now, this is a very serious problem for the social compact, or the idea of a stable South Africa, really. Because if we say that it takes multiple generations for change to happen, that's not really an acceptable status quo for people in South Africa. If you grow up in a country where meritocracy is a myth, and if you're black, you're more likely to be, you're not earning as much as a white person simply because of the history and simply because of institutional injustices. There's really no reason for you to accept that it's going to take another 50, 100 years before your grandkids can suddenly be in a decent situation. So there is a very real question we need to start asking ourselves about how we deal with the fact that it's probably going to take a very long time for transformation to happen, and how we adjust our economic policy to make sure that, first of all, that transformation happens as fast as possible, so making sure our public institutions are as good as possible, things like education and healthcare and whatever it might be, but also really thinking about how that changes what we think is needed in order to create transformation. And I think it has basically 3 implications. First, the obvious one is that we need more jobs and we need to reduce unemployment. That's kind of the basic thing that we say in every economic question. But the second and third are a bit different, I think. The second is that we need to have a proper distribution of jobs. So we need to have a distribution of jobs that is not just clustered into poor jobs and rich jobs that makes it impossible to move from one end to the other end. You need to have a fair distribution of jobs across the income category to allow people in working class jobs to give their children access to middle class jobs and allow their middle class children to get access to higher earning jobs. That type of distribution is hard to do, but in a country particularly where we have our industrial structure, we've got very rich, high-earning jobs in the service sector and very poor, low-earning jobs in the mining sector, for example. That's something we need to think about, because with that level of polarization, it's very hard to cross that gap and have real transformation. And then the third thing, and perhaps slightly more controversial, I would claim that we actually need to think beyond jobs. We need to think beyond job creation being a simple panacea in order to solve South Africa's problems. And the reason I say that is because if your society is not able to give access to people because you've got these massive inequalities, access to things like education or social or basic income, then you don't have a society that is well equipped to create jobs. Basically, many of the fundamental structural barriers that our companies face, things like a lack of skills, or things like high demands from labor, or strikes, whatever it might be, those types of problems are caused by a society that is not just and that does not provide for everyone. In a sense, what we need is to have a rich society before we can create jobs. And that's a very, again, difficult and contradictory thing to do. But we do need to start thinking about creating mechanisms that allow people to get access to at least some more money through, for example, the social welfare system, which I'll talk about a bit later if I have a chance, and some social institutions that can help us create a level of wealth that really propels job creation. Let me talk briefly about job creation itself with an eye on the time. We really have to also ask ourselves where the jobs are going to come from. The traditional answer, and the answer that I would normally give, is manufacturing. Industrial promotion that creates some kind of manufacturing revolution that creates a whole lot of extra jobs. And it does seem like that's the big option. It's still something I believe in, and it's still something I work on a lot. So certainly I hope it continues because that's what I'm good at. But we also need to start thinking about a situation where manufacturing is no longer the answer. And I say that for two reasons. First of all, because manufacturing is rapidly undergoing a de-skilling as a result of technology. Some work we've done indicates that 42% of South African jobs, as it stands, are at high risk of being displaced by technology within the next 30 years. And manufacturing in particular is vulnerable to that. And it's not just about jobs disappearing, it's also about jobs becoming less high quality. With these types of technological change, you don't have someone undertaking the same level of skill-intensive work that you used to when manufacturing was at its height 50 years ago, but rather you have people doing simple basic maintenance around machines or making sure that things don't break down. And those types of jobs don't provide the same level of social propulsion that they used to in the manufacturing sector. And the second reason I say that is simply because, as I said before, manufacturing is